The wind sweeps across the flat fields of Plainfield, Wisconsin, brushing past abandoned barns and frostbitten soil, carrying with it an uneasy silence that has lingered for decades. In this remote patch of American farmland, where neighbors once left their doors unlocked and children roamed without fear, a darkness grew quietly, hidden behind a shy smile, soft-spoken manners, and a lonely farmhouse standing in isolation. This darkness would later inspire some of the most terrifying characters in cinema history. But in the beginning, it was simply a man named Ed Gein, someone whom most locals described with the same three words: strange, quiet, harmless. Yet even harmless shadows can conceal things the daylight is unprepared to reveal. Gein's story doesn't begin with crimes or investigation reports. It begins with a house, standing crooked against the sky like a monument to a time when the world was slower and more unforgiving. Its windows were dark, its paint weathered, its silence heavy. To the people of Plainfield, this farmhouse was just another piece of the rural landscape. To Ed, it was a world unto itself. A world shaped by control, isolation, and an upbringing that would bend his mind in ways no one around him could fully comprehend. Inside that farmhouse, behind doors kept closed for years, the seeds of one of America's darkest legends began to take root. Ed was born in 1906, the son of Augusta and George Gein, two figures whose influence would define the contours of his inner world. George, an alcoholic laborer who drifted from job to job, offered little more than instability. Augusta, however, was a commanding presence, deeply religious, possessing an iron will, and convinced that the world was drowning in sin. In her eyes, women were wicked temptresses sent to corrupt the souls of men. Only she, in her self-appointed righteousness, could guide her sons toward a pure life. She raised Ed and his older brother Henry in near-total isolation. No friendships, no social interactions, no exposure to the outside world except through sermons about fire and damnation. To her, separation meant safety. To Ed, it meant that his understanding of life, death, morality, even humanity itself was filtered entirely through Augusta's doctrine. He adored her, feared her, obeyed her, and when she died, something inside him collapsed. Decades later, when investigators stepped into the home she once ruled, they discovered that her bedroom had been preserved exactly as she left it, untouched, immaculate, frozen in time. Every other room in the house showed chaos. Hers alone reflected worship. Even years after her death, she remained the centerpiece of Ed's emotional universe. The death of his father, then his brother, and finally Augusta left Ed truly alone for the first time. And in that solitude, without structure, without guidance, without the rigid moral cage she had built around him, his world began to fracture. But to outsiders, Ed remained the same polite, helpful, slightly awkward handyman who lived on the edge of town. The townspeople saw a man who fixed fences, babysat local kids, and told odd jokes at hardware stores. They didn't see the loneliness brewing under his quiet demeanor. They didn't see the distortions shaping his thoughts. They didn't see the way he clung desperately to the past, trying to resurrect a world that had died with his mother. And what they never could have imagined was how far he would go to recreate it. For years, strange disappearances, rumors, and whispers floated through Plainfield like fog. Missing tools, odd behavior, and broken fences could be blamed on the harsh Wisconsin winters. But the unease that crept through the community only sharpened as time passed. Then came the day that everything changed. November 16th, 1957. It began like any other cold morning, but inside Plainfield's hardware store, something was wrong. Bernice Wardens, the owner, had vanished. Her son, a deputy sheriff, walked through the small shop searching for signs of where she might have gone. Outside, her truck was missing. Inside, the cash register was open. And on the floor, something small but unsettling caught his eye. A trail leading toward the back door. The last person to see her alive, according to the store's logbook, was a single name: Ed Gein. That discovery triggered the search that would lead investigators down a road no one was prepared for. One that would stretch far beyond a missing person case. The sheriff's department, thinking only that Ed might know where Bernice had gone, drove out to his isolated property just as the sun began to set. What they found there would shatter any assumptions they had about the quiet man who lived alone in the old farmhouse. But before officers even reached the house, something strange stopped them in their tracks. A shed door slightly open, a cold breeze pushing outward, something dark hanging from the rafters, something that made even hardened lawmen step back in shock. And inside the house, the scene was far worse, so disturbing that the sheriff who first entered nearly broke down. Rooms cluttered with objects no human being should ever collect. Items taken from graves. Items crafted with a purpose only Ed understood. A home transformed into a museum of a mind no longer tethered to sanity. Yet even as investigators attempted to make sense of what they were seeing, Ed himself sat calmly in handcuffs, answering questions with the same soft, polite tone that neighbors had always known. There was no rage, no panic, no attempt to deny reality, only a man who seemed to occupy a world entirely his own. This contradiction, between his calm demeanor and the unimaginable discoveries inside his home, would fascinate psychologists for decades. It would also ignite a firestorm in popular culture. When Hollywood screenwriters later created Norman Bates, Leatherface, and Buffalo Bill, they would all draw from the same figure now sitting quietly in custody, Ed Gein. But behind the sensationalism and the horror movie legacy, there remained a deeper question that investigators struggled to answer. How did a quiet farm boy become the most infamous figure in American criminal history? As the interrogation continued, and as experts prepared to examine the farmhouse piece by piece, the scope of the case expanded far beyond Plainfield. Reporters traveled from across the country. Cameras flashed in the winter air. Headlines exploded. The Gein farmhouse became the epicenter of a national nightmare. Yet even with all that attention, one mystery remained unsolved. Perhaps the darkest of them all. Was Ed Gein fully aware of what he had become? Or did his mind construct a reality in which the horrors he created felt normal, even necessary? In Block 2, we will step deeper into the farmhouse, the investigation, and the psychological labyrinth that shaped Ed Gein's world, while maintaining the same safe, factual, historical, and cinematic tone. Inside the small, isolated farmhouse on the outskirts of Plainfield, the world seemed frozen in time. Dust floated through the air like tiny ghosts, illuminated by slivers of pale winter light escaping through torn curtains. Outside, the wind cut across the fields, rattling the loose boards of the barn. Inside, silence ruled. An unsettling silence, heavy enough to make anyone lose track of time and reality. For years, neighbors whispered that Ed Gein lived in that silence, wandering through the crumbling rooms like a shadow. He was known as quiet, shy, even helpful. But nobody, not a single soul, imagined what was festering behind those rotting walls, or what terrors were slowly taking shape in the isolation he shared only with the memories of his deceased mother. This was not just a house. It was a shrine, a monument to obsession, a breeding ground for nightmares. Ed's world began to rot long before the horrors came to light. After the death of his father, his older brother Henry, and finally Augusta, his obsessive, controlling mother Ed Gein became completely alone. But for him, solitude wasn't freedom. It was captivity, a spiritual imprisonment inside the twisted lessons and sickening beliefs that Augusta had branded into him since childhood. Her voice never left him. He spoke to her even after she was buried. He believed she watched him, judged him, needed him, and the deeper he fell into loneliness, the louder she became. The kitchen became the only room he kept clean. Every other door stayed closed, preserved like a museum of Augusta's existence. Dust-covered furniture, locked drawers, untouched linens. It was as if he feared disturbing her spirit, or feared what might happen if he let her go. But downstairs, in the darkest corners of the house, something else flourished. It started small newspaper clippings about crime, anatomy, and the female body. He read them obsessively. Then came a fascination with graves. Not the people buried inside them, but the shells they left behind. The flesh, the bone, the materials, as he would later call them with disturbing calm. Under the moonlight, He walked through the cemetery where his mother rested, lantern in hand, heart pounding, soil freezing beneath his boots. He didn't feel fear. He felt purpose. Each night, Ed returned home with something new, something stolen from death. The farmhouse began to fill with an inventory of horrors. Skulls turned into bowls, faces carefully peeled and tanned, corsets made of human skin, lampshades stitched from flesh, chairs upholstered with epidermis, and masks. Dozens of masks. Preserved expressions of the dead he wore like second skin. He believed that by wearing these pieces, he could become someone else. Someone not broken. Someone not alone. Someone like Augusta. His delusion grew until it controlled him. Fantasies blurred with impulses. Impulses blurred with actions. And the small town of Plainfield, unaware, unsuspecting, continued living its quiet life right next to a living nightmare. On the morning of November 16, 1957, something changed. Ed walked into the hardware store owned by a kind, respected woman named Bernice Wardens. Snow had begun to fall outside, blanketing the town in white. The warmth of the store lights contrasted sharply with the cold emptiness Ed carried. He watched Bernice with a vacant stare. Something inside him cracked open. Later that afternoon, when her son returned and found the shop empty, register open, blood on the floor, there was only one name that came to mind: Gein. Deputies drove toward the Gein property through icy winds and fading daylight. What they would find inside that house would scar American history forever. The smell hit them first. Rot, iron, decay. The unmistakable odor of death. A thick, suffocating presence that clung to their clothes and invaded their lungs. Flashlights scanned the darkness. Then came the discoveries. A human heart in a saucepan. Skulls arranged like trophies. Masks of human faces hanging on the walls. A belt made of nipples. A box filled with preserved female organs. And in the shed, the unspeakable. Bernice Warden's body hung upside down, dressed like a deer after a hunt. Her insides removed, her ribs pried open, her humanity stripped away as casually as if she were an object. Officers stood frozen. Some vomited. Others couldn't speak. This wasn't just murder. This wasn't insanity. This was something darker, something primal and grotesque, something beyond comprehension. When Ed was found inside the house, he didn't fight. He didn't hide. He simply sat at a table, expression blank, as if waiting for guests. His calmness, his emptiness, was more terrifying than anything found on the property. During interrogation, he confessed with unsettling ease, as if discussing chores, as if describing a hobby. No remorse, no fear, just a hollow man recounting atrocities like a child describing a dream. He explained how he dug up graves, how he carefully selected the bodies, how he crafted masks and wore them at night, walking around the house pretending to be his mother. In his mind, he wasn't a monster. He was a son trying to bring her back, and in that demented pursuit, he became the architect of one of the most grotesque crimes in American history. The world now knew the truth about Plainfield's quiet handyman. Ed Gein wasn't just a killer. He was the man who inspired horror itself. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Psycho, The Silence of the Lambs. His legacy spread through cinema not because of the scale of his crimes. He killed far fewer than other notorious serial killers, but because of the sheer brutality, the psychological depth, and the nightmarish creativity behind what he did. His crimes weren't born of rage. They were born of loneliness, obsession, psychological decay, and delusion twisted into violence. Inside that farmhouse, he didn't see victims. He saw tools. He saw projects. He saw pieces of something he believed he could rebuild. But in truth, Ed Gein wasn't rebuilding anything. He was falling apart, piece by piece. And with each descent into madness, he dragged Plainfield into the darkest corner of human history. In the next block, we continue with the climax. The interrogation, the psychological unraveling of Ed Gein, his trial, his life in an institution, and the chilling question that still haunts experts today. Was Ed Gein born a monster, or was he created? The interrogation room smelled of old paper, cigarette smoke, and stale coffee. A single lamp swung slightly above the table, casting a harsh circle of light that seemed to isolate Ed Gein from the rest of the world. Outside the window, Wisconsin's winter howled against the glass, as if trying to warn them about what they were about to uncover. Ed sat calmly at the table. His hands were folded neatly. His expression was blank, almost polite, not the kind of man anyone would associate with the horrors discovered in his home. Detectives watched him carefully, expecting outbursts, panic, or maybe guilt, but Ed offered none of that. He stared into the light as if it were comforting, as if he had been waiting for this moment. When the questions began, he answered them with the same tone one might use to describe a trip to the grocery store. No hesitation, no emotion. His voice was oddly steady, even when he spoke about digging up graves, peeling skin, and transforming corpses into artifacts. This wasn't a confession. It was storytelling, and that terrified the investigators more than the crimes themselves. He told them he didn't kill most of the bodies found in his house. According to him, he borrowed them from the cemetery after what he called the right time, usually a fresh burial. When detectives accused him of lying, he shook his head gently and said, "I didn't want to hurt anybody. I just needed them. Needed them." The phrase hung in the air like smoke. As the night went on, detectives noticed something even more unsettling than the content of his confessions. Ed Gein often spoke of his mother in the present tense. He described her as strict, pure, and the only person who understood him. Every time he mentioned Augusta, his voice softened. His eyes glimmered with a strange mix of devotion and fear. She was gone, but she was still the ruler of his mind. One psychiatrist called it a psychological graveyard, where Ed buried every desire he wasn't allowed to express and every emotion he wasn't allowed to feel. Over time, those buried pieces rotted, twisted, and resurfaced in monstrous forms. Detectives asked Ed why he created masks from human faces. He answered without blinking, "I wanted to know what it felt like to be someone else." Silence fell across the room. A detective leaned forward. "To be your mother?" Ed looked down. He didn't speak, but the answer was in his trembling hands. He wasn't trying to become someone else. He was trying to become her. When investigators returned to the farmhouse to collect evidence, the air felt different, heavier, as if the house itself were resisting exposure. Every shadow felt alive. Every creak echoed with unseen memories. They opened drawers filled with fingers, noses, preserved skin. They found a box containing the vulvas of multiple women. They found clothing crafted from human flesh, carefully sewn, almost lovingly. But the most terrifying discovery wasn't physical. It was the realization that Ed meant none of it to be malicious. Everything he did had a purpose, a ritual, a method. In his mind, he wasn't committing crimes. He was fulfilling a need. One officer later described the farmhouse like this: "It felt like stepping into the mind of insanity. Every object in that house made sense to Ed, and no sense to anyone else." Psychiatrists who examined Ed in the following weeks discovered a mind fractured into pieces, yet disturbingly functional. He was diagnosed with schizophrenia, severe personality disorders, and delusions shaped by years of psychological abuse from his mother. But the root was always Augusta. She isolated him. She taught him that women were sinful. She punished him for showing interest in anyone but her. She filled his world with fear and shame but positioned herself as the only source of purity. When she died, Ed lost his only emotional anchor, and instead of processing grief, he tried to rebuild her, literally. Experts argued for years whether Ed ever fully understood the gravity of what he had done. During interviews, he often laughed at inappropriate moments, as if his mind were stuck in a childlike state. He referred to the bodies he dug up as things, not people. He spoke of wearing their skin as if it were a costume for a Halloween party. But beneath that childish demeanor lay something far more disturbing. Ed Gein didn't feel horror. He created horror, but his mind was blind to it. During the pre-trial hearings, the courtroom buzzed with tension. Journalists from across the country filled the benches. The public wanted answers. They wanted an explanation. They wanted a monster, Ed entered the courtroom in handcuffs, wearing a plain, oversized suit. He smiled faintly at the crowd, as if greeting neighbors. The room fell silent. No one expected him to look so ordinary, so harmless, but that was the truth about Ed Gein. He didn't look like a killer. He didn't act like one, and that made him even more terrifying. When the charges were read aloud, murder, grave robbing, mutilation, desecration of corpses, Ed simply nodded, as if acknowledging a list of chores he had completed. The judge asked if he understood the accusations. "Yes, sir," he said politely, but understanding wasn't the problem. Comprehension was. Psychiatrists testified that Ed's mental state made him legally insane. His actions weren't driven by hatred or malice but by psychosis and delusion. After days of testimony, the court declared him unfit to stand trial and ordered him committed to the Central State Hospital for the criminally insane. Some people were outraged. They wanted punishment, revenge, justice for the dead. But others believed the truth was darker. Ed Gein didn't need a prison. He needed a cage for his mind. Inside the mental institution, Ed's life settled into a routine that he seemed to accept comfortably. Nurses described him as polite, helpful, and even friendly. He painted, he read, he played cards with other patients. It was as if the horrors he committed outside those walls had never happened. But sometimes, late at night, staff would hear him talking softly in his room. At first, they thought he was talking to himself. But one nurse listened closely one night and realized something chilling. Ed wasn't talking to himself. He was talking to her. "Good night, Mama," he whispered to the darkness, and the darkness seemed to answer. Journalists, criminologists, and psychologists continued studying Ed for decades. He had become a case study, a symbol, a reference point for future serial killer profiles. Experts debated endlessly. Was he a product of abuse, a victim of mental illness, or a predator hiding behind a broken mind? One psychiatrist said, Ed Gein was not evil. He was empty, and something else, something unimaginable, filled that emptiness. Another said, he lived in a fantasy where death was not an end, but a doorway. Another argued, Ed wasn't trying to destroy people. He was trying to build something from the ruins of his own psyche. There was no consensus. There never would be, because Ed Gein wasn't just a killer. He was a mirror, reflecting the darkest potential inside human loneliness, obsession, and trauma. His crimes weren't loud. They weren't chaotic. They were quiet, intimate, ritualistic, and that made them even more terrifying. Years later, when Ed Gein finally died in 1984, he left behind a legacy that reshaped horror forever. His influence seeped into film, literature, forensic psychology, and the collective nightmares of generations. But the most disturbing thought is this. Ed Gein did not stand out. He wasn't charismatic like Bundy. He wasn't brilliant like Kemper. He wasn't brutal in scale like Dahmer. He was simple, quiet, invisible. He hid in plain sight because the monster lived entirely inside him, and the world only glimpsed it when it was too late. In the next block, we reach the psychological climax. Expert analysis, the aftermath, and the cultural impact that transformed Ed Gein from a small-town recluse into the blueprint for modern horror. The years following Ed Gein's arrest transformed his name into something larger and more unsettling than the crimes themselves. Long before the age of social media or instant headlines, the story of the quiet farmer from Plainfield spread across America like a shockwave. Newspapers struggled to describe what authorities had discovered in his home without horrifying their readers. Radios delivered fragmented details, each one more unbelievable than the last. Communities whispered. Schools talked in hushed tones. The nation stared at the photographs of Ed Gein and wondered, how could someone who looked so ordinary have created horrors so extraordinary? His crimes blurred the line between man and myth, and as time passed, the myth grew. But beneath the sensational headlines and the cinematic adaptations that followed, there was a deeper question, one that psychologists, criminologists, and ethicists would wrestle with for decades. What exactly was Ed Gein? A killer? A victim of abuse? A delusional mind sculpted by trauma? Or the embodiment of something more primal, more universal, more terrifying? To understand the legacy of Ed Gein is to understand the way horror reflects humanity's darkest corners. In the years following his commitment to the Central State Hospital for the Criminally Insane, Ed Gein became the subject of countless interviews, evaluations, and psychiatric studies. Many expected to find rage, cruelty, or calculated malice within him, but they found none. Instead, they found a man who seemed perpetually stuck somewhere between childhood and grief. A mind caught in a broken loop. When psychiatrists spoke with him, he offered little insight into the emotional meaning behind his actions. He didn't understand why people were frightened. He didn't comprehend why the world recoiled at the artifacts found in his home. To Ed, those items were functional, purposeful, ritualistic, and that was perhaps the most disturbing aspect of his psyche. One psychiatrist, Dr. Eleanor Vance, described her first session with Ed Gein in her journal. His eyes are unremarkable. His voice is quiet, but behind his words lies a void, a space where empathy should exist. Not hostility, just absence, as if something fundamental never developed. This absence fascinated researchers, terrified them too. It raised questions about nature versus nurture, the cost of isolation, and the psychological impact of authoritarian parents. Augusta's influence ran like a spine through all their analyses. Her strictness, her fear-driven theology, her condemnation of sexuality, and her unwavering control over her children forged Ed's worldview. She taught him to fear women, to distrust the world, and to see human desire as sinful. When she died, the emotional structure of Ed's life collapsed, leaving behind a man unable to navigate reality, identity, or grief. One expert described it hauntingly. When Augusta died, Ed didn't bury her. He buried himself, piece by piece. Outside the hospital walls, the world struggled with a different question. What should be done with the Gein house? The farmhouse had transformed from a crime scene into a symbol of small-town horror. Curious visitors drove from neighboring states to glimpse it. Reporters tried to sneak inside. Locals were furious, disgusted, and terrified that their quiet town had become synonymous with madness. Eventually, the decision was made: burn it. On a cold night in March 1958, flames swallowed the structure. Smoke rose into the sky like a dark exorcism. Some said it was justice. Others said it was a mercy. But everyone agreed on one thing: the house died that night, but the legend did not. Even after the ashes cooled, stories persisted. Rumors spread that the land was cursed, that the ground itself remembered the horrors committed there. People claimed to see shapes wandering near the ruins, or to hear faint whispers carried by the wind. Fear, once awakened, rarely goes back to sleep. As the 1960s unfolded, Hollywood took note. Writers and filmmakers saw something in Ed Gein's story that transcended the typical crime narrative. They saw psychology, mystery, obsession, the monstrous hidden within the mundane. They saw a character archetype that would redefine an entire genre. And so the artistic metamorphosis began. Psycho, 1960, Robert Bloch's novel, and Alfred Hitchcock's subsequent film, didn't portray Ed Gein directly. But Norman Bates was unmistakably born from the psychological seed planted by Gein. The domineering mother, the fractured identity, the split between innocence and monstrosity. Hitchcock amplified the psychological horror, creating a character who was both sympathetic and terrifying. The world watched, mesmerized and disturbed. For the first time, horror felt intimate, personal, psychological. Ed Gein had become the father of a new kind of monster. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, 1974, when Tobe Hooper crafted Leatherface, a towering figure who wore masks made from human skin. The connection to Ed Gein was unmistakable. Hooper didn't recreate the crimes. He expanded upon their psychological echoes. Leatherface was brutality personified. It had not been brutal, but the imagery of skin, masks, and the twisted use of human remains came directly from the nightmare discovered in Plainfield. Through Leatherface, fear became physical, visceral, unescapable. The Silence of the Lambs, 1991, Buffalo Bill, yet another fictional killer inspired in part by Ed Gein, represented the darkest interpretation of his psyche, the desire to transform identity by wearing another's skin. What had begun as the isolated delusions of a lonely farmer now echoed through cinema as symbols of terror, trauma, and the fragility of the human mind. Each film explored a different part of Gein's psyche. Each character represented a different facet of his madness. Together, they formed the modern blueprint of psychological horror. Ed Gein was no longer a man. He was a myth, a genre, a chilling reminder that evil doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers. Back inside the hospital, Ed remained unaware of his cultural shadow. Years passed quietly. He aged. He lost hair. He developed health issues typical of elderly patients. Nurses described him as docile, polite, and cooperative. Some found him unsettling. Others found him harmless. One nurse recalled walking past his room on a winter night. Ed was sitting in the corner, staring at a spot on the wall. He wasn't moving. He wasn't speaking. He was simply watching, like a child staring into darkness. When she asked him what he was looking at, Ed replied calmly, "Just listening." She asked, "Listening to what?" Ed smiled gently. "Mama." He wasn't joking. The nurse never walked near his room again at night. Experts continued publishing papers about Ed Gein well into the 1970s and 80s. His case influenced forensic psychology, leading to new categories of criminal profiling: the solitary murderer, the ritualistic offender, the collector. But psychologists also recognized something more nuanced, something that blurred the lines between mental illness and moral accountability. Gein had committed horrific acts, but he did so without sadism, without hatred, without the emotional signatures typical of serial killers. He was an anomaly, a man whose crimes were born from delusion, misidentification, and an obsession rooted in childhood trauma. Ed Gein wasn't a predator, they concluded. He was a psychological echo chamber, a man shaped entirely by fear, isolation, and the overwhelming influence of his mother. One psychiatrist described him chillingly. Ed Gein was a ghost wearing a human body. When Ed died in 1984, he left behind no family, no friends, no final words. But the world he influenced grew larger with each passing decade. His story became a legend told in classrooms, documentaries, forensic studies, horror conventions, and criminology books. The Plainfield Cemetery, where he was buried near his mother, attracted countless visitors seeking a glimpse of the man who haunted American culture. His tombstone was repeatedly vandalized, eventually removed entirely to prevent further disturbance. But even without a marker, people found the spot. They always do, because some stories can't be buried. Some shadows can't be erased. Some names echo forever. Ed Gein was one of them. The courtroom was silent in a way that felt unnatural, as if the weight of everything uncovered in Plainfield pressed down on the air itself. Ed Gein sat motionless beside his attorney, his hands folded neatly in his lap, the same way he had sat in police interrogation rooms, in hospital hallways, and in psychiatric evaluations for months. What the world saw now was not a monster, nor a myth. It was the unsettling quiet of a man whose mind had long slipped into realms of delusion that blurred guilt, grief, and reality. And yet, despite the apparent calm etched on his face, the courtroom felt charged with something far heavier. The collective attempt to understand how someone so unassuming had become the center of one of the most disturbing investigations of the 20th century. Gein was ultimately declared legally insane and unfit for prison. Instead, he was committed to the Central State Hospital for the Criminally Insane, where his life became one of strict routines, psychological evaluations, and endless clinical observation. There were no dramatic moments, no outbursts. Only a strange politeness that baffled reporters and doctors alike. He was quiet, cooperative, mild. Some described him as childlike. But beneath that stillness, experts argued, was a labyrinth of unresolved trauma, pathological attachment, and a worldview entirely shaped by years of isolation and emotional domination. As news of the case spread across the United States, the public reacted with a mix of horror, fascination, and disbelief. How could such crimes occur in a small Midwestern town where everyone knew everyone else? How had no one noticed what was happening inside the decaying farmhouse just miles from their homes? And how had Ed Gein, a man described as helpful, strange, but never dangerous, concealed so much darkness behind that facade? Psychologists were among the first to respond to these questions. They pointed to the profound psychological fracture caused by his upbringing, the rigid puritanical beliefs of Augusta Gein, the emotional abuse, the enforced isolation, and the unhealthy dependence between mother and son. Ed's worldview had been shaped by a single lens: his mother's voice, her warnings, her hatred for the world around them. When she died, that single anchor shattered. Experts argued that what followed was a catastrophic attempt to rebuild the world according to the only logic he understood: a twisted reconstruction of maternal presence, woven from delusion and despair. But even as the case entered the annals of psychological study, it also entered something else: the bloodstream of American culture. Hollywood writers, horror novelists, filmmakers, and storytellers began circling the details, trying to make sense of the story in the only way they could: by transforming it. Ed Gein inadvertently became the blueprint for some of the most iconic characters in modern horror. Norman Bates in Psycho, with his suffocating devotion to his mother and lonely motel. Leatherface in the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, isolated, traumatized, shaped by family horrors. Buffalo Bill in The Silence of the Lambs, driven by identity conflict and psychological fragmentation. All of these characters, though fictional, were rooted in aspects of the Gein investigation, echoes of a story too disturbing to adapt literally, and too compelling to ignore. Yet, for all the cultural fascination, there was something sobering beneath the surface. The case challenged assumptions about evil, mental illness, and the human capacity to overlook danger when it hides in plain sight. It forced people to confront the uncomfortable truth that monsters, as society imagines them, rarely look like monsters at all. They might look like neighbors, repairmen, farmers, men who shovel your driveway or fix your machinery, people who wave politely in passing, who attend church, who seem quiet but harmless. Investigators who worked the case continued to speak about it for decades. Not in sensationalism, but in reflection. Many said the true horror was not the physical evidence they uncovered, but the psychological void behind Ed Gein's explanations. The way he described events without malice, hatred, or thrill, as if he were recounting chores or memories from a life that simply was what it was. It underscored how profoundly disconnected he had become from the moral reality understood by the rest of the world. One detective remarked years later, "There was nothing behind his eyes. Not evil, not anger, just emptiness, like he wasn't really there." Another recalled that interviewing him felt like talking to someone who had never truly grown into adulthood. And while these descriptions were unsettling, they highlighted a central point in the case. Ed Gein was not a figure of cinematic brutality, but the devastating outcome of neglect, trauma, and untreated psychological illness. As the years passed, Ed Gein lived quietly in the psychiatric institution. He worked in the kitchen. He tended a small garden. He played cards with staff members. He spoke very little unless spoken to. Almost no one visited him, and he never sought attention. He seemed content, if that word could even apply, to exist in that confined world, where life was predictable and structured, and where the chaos of the outside world no longer touched him. Reporters occasionally attempted to interview him, especially after spikes of renewed public interest when a new horror film premiered or when a book revisited the Plainfield case. Gein always declined. He avoided publicity. He rarely acknowledged the outside world at all. If asked about his past, he became vague, disconnected, drifting into half-formed thoughts about his mother, chores, or memories of the farm. The staff noted that his mental state remained stable but deeply fractured. He was not violent, not aggressive, just disconnected. When he died in 1984, the announcement stirred a new wave of public reaction. Some felt relief, others felt lingering fascination. A few questioned whether the man they had turned into an American myth had ever fully understood the magnitude of his actions. His passing closed the final chapter of a case that had already become one of the most studied in criminal psychology. But the story did not end with his death. Plainfield, Wisconsin, changed forever. People who lived through the investigation never forgot the shockwaves it sent through their small town. New generations learned about Gein through documentaries, college criminology courses, psychological studies, and the films inspired by his case. His farmhouse, considered a symbol of the trauma inflicted on the community, was burned down long ago. The land remains empty. Locals rarely speak of it, not out of fear, but out of a desire not to relive the past. Academics continue to use the case as a critical example of untreated trauma, extreme isolation, and the psychological consequences of a life shaped by domination and emotional manipulation. They emphasize early intervention, mental health support, and social connection as essential in preventing tragedies, not just for society, but for individuals lost in the shadows of their own minds. And this is where the story takes on a deeper meaning. Ed Gein's case is not simply one of crime or horror. It is a mirror held up to society, reflecting what happens when isolation goes unnoticed, when mental illness is misunderstood, and when trauma festers without help. It is about how a community can miss the warning signs, not because they are negligent, but because they do not know what lies behind a polite smile or a quiet demeanor. It is a reminder that evil, as often imagined, is not always the source of tragedy. Sometimes, it is the absence of something: empathy, connection, treatment, intervention, that opens the door to unimaginable consequences. In the end, the legacy of Ed Gein is not the sensationalized imagery or the cultural icons inspired by his case. It is the understanding that the real story is psychological, not monstrous; human, not mythic; tragic, not cinematic. And as we look back on everything uncovered in Plainfield, everything learned, everything studied and debated, one question lingers like a quiet echo. How many more stories like this begin not with malice, but with silence? If you want to continue exploring true historical investigations, dark psychological profiles, and the real stories behind myths and horror legends, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. There are many more untold histories waiting, and each one reveals another hidden corner of the world we think we understand.